Environment and Oversight will come to order. Without objection, the Chair is authorized to declare recesses of the subcommittee at any time. Welcome to today's hearing entitled, At What Cost? Examining the Social Cost of Carbon. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Welcome to today's joint subcommittee hearing entitled, At What Cost? Examining the Social Cost of Carbon. Today we will examine the previous administration's determination of the social cost of carbon, or SCC, and explore why the calculated value is flawed. Energy is the bedrock of our society, and yet the SCC estimate of the previous administration has killed jobs, limited innovation, and resulted in higher energy costs for American families, all in exchange for benefits that are negligible at best and non-existent at worst. The Obama administration's interagency working group, which ultimately established an enormously high SCC of $37 per ton of CO2 emitted into the atmosphere, relied on an outdated economic model and failed to take into account the White House's own Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, guidelines for cost-benefit analysis. Quite simply, the working group used numbers that got them the results they wanted in order to advance some of the most expensive and expansive regulations ever written. In pushing forward this political agenda, the working group acted irresponsibly. It also allowed the previous administration to implement stringent and costly regulations without a scientific basis. As we will learn today, the SCC working group ignored two major OMB recommendations for federal agency rulemaking. First, it failed to use a 7% discount rate and instead relied on rates of 2.5%, 3%, and 5%. And second, it ignored the guideline to report cost-benefit analysis from a domestic perspective. If nothing else is taken away from what will be a very technical hearing, I hope it will be these two very basic flaws. The low long-term discount rate established by the previous administration fundamentally disregards the notion that the American economy is resilient and can respond to potential future threats with technological development and innovation. As to the flaw of the previous administration's decision to focus on CO2 emissions from a global perspective, this approach leaves the U.S. footing the bill for costly regulations that are based on benefits conferred to other countries. It is simply not right for Americans to be bearing the brunt of cost when the majority of benefits will be conferred away from home. By ignoring OMB guidelines, the current SCC models leave critical components out of the discussion. If the OMB guidelines would have been followed, the social cost of carbon would have been significantly lower. The previous administration disregarded scientific integrity by overestimating climate change resulting from greenhouse gas emissions. In order to push an expensive regulatory agenda, the administration inflated the SCC to justify costly regulations in response to the allegedly terrible CO2 emissions, terrible damage CO2 emissions will cause in the future. The SCC is nothing but a one-sided manipulation of parameters to fit the policy-driven agendas of the previous administration. These alarmist tactics need to stop. Today's hearing is intended to uncover the real truth and deception behind the SCC. America's strength emanates from our resilience and flexibility. Attempts to justify government regulations over industry innovation hinders growth and development. I look forward to working with the Trump administration to renew faith in American ingenuity and technological development. I now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Environment, Ms. Bonamici, for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. The social cost of carbon is a metric used to value the damage caused by emitting 1 ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in a year. It provides a consistent value for all federal agencies to use for their cost-benefit analysis on regulatory efforts that reduce carbon dioxide emissions. There are some people who criticize this metric, but the Government Accountability Office and independent peer review by the National Academy of Sciences have validated it many times. Additionally, federal courts have upheld that the methodology used to develop the social cost of carbon is based on robust science and sound economic analysis. It is critical that updates to the social cost of carbon metric are based on the best available science and updated economic analysis based on peer-reviewed literature. The Government Accountability Office has found that the methodology used to develop the social cost of carbon was based on peer-reviewed academic literature and took steps to incorporate new information as it became available. This process also provided ample opportunity for public comment on both the social cost of carbon and the regulations that use the metric in their cost-benefit analysis. Some people suggest that regulations to reduce emission of carbon dioxide and other pollutants are unnecessary because climate change does not exist or human activity does not contribute to it, but simply ignoring a fact does not make it less true. The climate is warming, and we need to work now to limit the consequences for future generations. Our children and grandchildren should not inherit an environment that degrades their health and harms their future economy. Economic growth and reducing carbon pollution are not in conflict with one another. Clean energy development allows us to continue powering our communities in ways that avoid long-term negative consequences on future generations. It also gives us the opportunity to bring new living wage jobs into communities. In fact, the American Wind Energy Association found that the wind energy sector accounts for 3,000 jobs throughout my home state of Oregon alone. In addition to boosting Oregon's economy, wind energy generation avoided more than 1 million tons of statewide carbon dioxide emissions in 2015, and many of the wind energy jobs are in rural areas where jobs are needed. The social cost of carbon is not a product of a single president, a single scientific study, or a single legal action. It is rooted in overwhelming scientific consensus on climate change and efforts spanning 30 years from both the executive and judicial branches of the federal government. These factors, coupled with a transparent development process and strong economic analysis, form the basis of this metric that has been used in at least 79 federal regulations, including fuel economy standards for vehicles, energy efficiency measures for home appliances, and regulations such as the Clean Power Plan. This metric was not invented to serve a political agenda, but in fact was developed to meet a legal mandate to justify in simple terms of dollars and cents how the federal government's actions will affect Americans today and our children and grandchildren tomorrow. I look forward to hearing how we may best continue to use the social cost of carbon in support of policies that protect our environment. With that, I would like to again thank the witnesses for being here today, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Ms. Bonamici. I now recognize the Chairman of the Subcommittee on Oversight, Mr. LaHood, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Biggs, and happy to be part of this hearing today with you. Today's hearing titled, "At What Cost? Examining the Social Cost of Carbon." And happy to have the witnesses here today as we examine the previous administration's social cost of carbon and the shortfalls in application of this flawed process. There is significant evidence that the previous administration manipulated the social cost of carbon calculation to reflect significant benefits to enacting what were ultimately job-killing regulations and policies across a wide spectrum of issues. The social cost of carbon is a flawed tool used by the Obama administration to justify a green agenda, when in reality, the prior administration was seeking to offset its costly regulations with far-reaching implications that burden our industries and nation. Unsurprisingly, the previous administration ignored specific guidelines set forth by the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, and used the social cost of carbon as a vehicle to tout the economic benefits of the new environmental regulations. This is troubling and to me is not being honest with the taxpayers. Critics take issue primarily with two aspects of the social cost of carbon methodology, specifically the discount rate used and the domestic versus global benefits claimed. Both issues I look forward to discussing in more detail with our panel of esteemed witnesses today. I, too, take issue with the methodology, but also the lack of transparency with the use and development of the social cost of carbon. 3 statistical integrated assessment economic models were used to develop the social cost of carbon: the fund, the DICE, and the PAGE. Experts have concluded these 3 models are flawed and possess too many uncertainties to be the foundation of the benefit analysis of environmental regulations. If one were to change the reasonable assumptions these models were based on, the result will drastically differ, demonstrating malleability in the social cost of carbon calculation. Because of these realities, last year I was pleased to be an original co-sponsor of H.R. 5668, the Transparency and Honesty in Energy Regulation Act, or THERA, introduced by my friend and colleague Evan Jenkins of West Virginia. This legislation is aimed at prohibiting the Department of Energy and the Environmental Protection Agency from considering the social cost of carbon as part of any cost-benefit analysis unless specifically authorized by law. If signed into law, the DOE and the EPA would no longer rely on manipulated and fabricated economic benefits to justify or support new job-killing environmental regulations. I look forward to working with Congressman Jenkins again on this issue this Congress. It appears that the social cost of carbon is nothing but a political tool lacking scientific integrity and transparency, conceived and utilized by an administration pushing a green agenda to the detriment of the American taxpayers. Perhaps a better measurement of the social cost of carbon is not the net damages that result from a 1 metric ton increase in carbon dioxide emissions in a given year, but the damage inflicted on domestic industries, including manufacturers in my district like Caterpillar, by the environmental regulations justified by this flawed calculation. I would like to thank our witnesses for being here today to discuss this important matter. In addition, I look forward to working with the Trump administration to reverse the damage caused by the Obama administration as it relates to this issue. With that, I yield back to the chair.
Thank you, Mr. LaHood. I now recognize the ranking member of the Subcommittee on Oversight, Mr. Beyer, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, all the witnesses, for being here. You know, the social cost of carbon is a complex metric, which our witness, Dr. Greenstone, has described as the most important number you've never heard of. Assessing and addressing the impact of climate change on current and future generations is critical. It seems already that in just the first few minutes of this hearing, we see a dramatic difference between the short-term emphasis on job creation, which is important, and the long-term emphasis on protecting our planet. The social cost of carbon permits the government to help quantify the future economic damages as a result of carbon pollution that contributes to climate change and global warming. This metric didn't materialize out of thin and dirty air. It took a federal judge to mandate its use during the Bush administration based on a law passed when Ronald Reagan was president. In 2009, the Obama administration convened an interagency effort to formalize a consistent value for it. This was not a political tool. This was an attempt to protect our environment. We'll hear today that this development process was transparent. There was open to public comment. It's been validated over the years. And much like our climate, it's not static, and it changes over time in response to updated inputs. And although its use has been challenged in the courts recently, the courts have upheld the methodology used to obtain this estimate as proper, based on real science and appropriate economic models. As an Minnesota administrative law judge determined last April, a preponderance of evidence supports the fact that federal social cost of carbon is reasonable and the best available measure to determine the environmental cost of CO2. I'm pretty certain we won't hear any of that today from the majority members and the witnesses. Instead, we'll hear the same arguments made against climate regulations that we've heard before. And sadly, those anti-science arguments both ignore the abundant scientific evidence that shows that climate change exists, that fossil fuel production is its main contributor, and will also admonish virtually any responsible regulatory mechanism to help protect our nation's citizens from the environmental, economic, and public health harm that results from climate change's global impacts. And these will argue already that the social cost of carbon is outdated, inaccurate, and not a proper regulatory mechanism for addressing climate change. We've heard these arguments before. In fact, in 1982, the tobacco company R.J. Reynolds produced internal talking points about the social cost of smoking when Congressman Henry Waxman was holding hearings regarding the harm to the public's health from cigarette smoking. At the time, Representative Waxman said the annual smoking-related costs and lost productivity was $25.8 billion and $13.6 billion in annual medical costs. R.J. Reynolds said, quote, that attempts to establish a dollar value of so-called costs of smoking are ill-founded and unreliable, end quote. More than 1 decade later, in 1994, the tobacco company Philip Morris was producing glossy brochures to combat the growing evidence revolving around the harm of cigarette smoking. One was titled, quote, Debunking the Social Costs of Smoking. And an internal memo from Philip Morris said simply, Philip Morris does not believe that smoking has been shown to pose any social costs on society. So we're going to hear similar arguments today on the social cost of carbon emissions from fossil fuels, their impact on climate change. These arguments resonate loudly with the new Trump administration, but they contradict the economic analysis and scientific evidence that supports the use of social cost of carbon. In a much-publicized recent memo, Thomas Pyle, the head of Trump's Department of Energy transition team, stated, quote, "If the social cost of carbon were subjected to the latest science, it would certainly be much lower than what the Obama administration has been using," end quote, and he suggested ending the use of it in federal rulemaking. The memo went on to describe plans to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement, eliminate the Clean Power Plan, increase federal oil and natural gas leasing, lift the moratorium on coal leasing, in other words, more and more and more fossil fuels at greater cost to the environment. Mr. Chairman, climate change is real. Scientific evidence across the world, we think we are the only country in the world that has any internal disagreement about climate change. And as members of the Science Committee, we should be leading the fight to protect our nation against its impacts. And I hope my colleagues will be persuaded by the weight of evidence. The evidence becomes ever clearer with every passing day, and we will work together to promote policies that protect our future generations. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Byer. I now recognize the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Smith, for his opening statement. Chairman Smith.
Thank you, Chairman Biggs, and congratulations on becoming the Chairman of the Environment Subcommittee. I look forward to helping you restrain the EPA's out-of-control regulatory agenda. The EPA, along with other federal agencies, often bases their regulations on models and science not familiar to most Americans. Americans are led to believe that the EPA's regulations are based on the best science available. Unfortunately, this committee has discovered that that is not the case. The EPA's track record does not inspire trust. For example, the EPA routinely relies on non-disclosed scientific studies to justify its regulations. But how can Americans believe an agency that isn't being open and honest? Another little-known component of environmental regulations is the social cost of carbon. The EPA attempts to put a price on a ton of carbon emitted into the atmosphere. This term is in many of the EPA's regulations. However, like many of the agency's determinations, it is often based on a one-sided political agenda. Many factors contribute to the value of the social cost of carbon. While multiple models are used to determine a value for carbon, the ones frequently used in regulations assume only a worst-case scenario for climate change impacts. Similar to climate models, which predict worst-case scenarios and are repeatedly proved wrong, the social cost of carbon used by federal agencies is also flawed. The federal government should not include faulty calculations to justify costly regulations. Examples would be the Clean Power Plan and standards used by the Department of Energy. Instead, it should eliminate the use of the social cost of carbon until a credible value can be calculated. Rushing to use unreliable calculations, such as the social cost of carbon, to justify regulation is irresponsible and misleading. For instance, the EPA's Clean Power Plan would cost billions of dollars every year in return for a minimal benefit on the environment. In fact, the regulation would reduce global temperatures by only 3/100ths of a degree Celsius and limit sea level rise by only the width of 3 sheets of paper. One of the many components used to justify this rule is the social cost of carbon. This flawed value desperately attempts to justify the agency's alarmist reasoning for support of the Clean Power Plan and other climate regulations. Agencies should rely on sound science, not flawed data. The fact that different models for the social cost of carbon exist and all have different values is a testament to how uncertain the science behind the value really is. For example, the social cost of carbon ranges from negative values to $37 per ton, which is the estimate used by the government agencies under the Obama administration. Before the EPA includes this value in rulemakings, the agency should reassess how it is determined. Americans deserve credible science, not regulations based on data that is suspect and calculated to justify the EPA's climate agenda. Sound science and actual data should lead the way, not politically calculated social cost. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll yield back.
Thank you, Chairman Smith. Let me introduce our witnesses. Our first witness today is Dr. Ted Gare, Vice President and Director of Economic Studies and Joseph A. Petchman, Senior Fellow at the Brookings Institute. Dr. Gayer received his bachelor's degree in mathematics and economics from Emory, his master's degree and PhD in economics from Duke University. Our next witness is Dr. Kevin Dayaratna, Senior Statistician and Research Programmer at the Heritage Foundation's Institute for Economic Freedom and Opportunities Center for Data Analysis. Dr. Dayaratna received his bachelor's degree in applied mathematics and mathematical physics from the University of California at Berkeley, his master's degrees in mathematical statistics and business management from the University of Maryland, and his PhD in mathematical statistics from the University of Maryland. Our third witness today is Dr. Michael Greenstone, Milton Friedman Professor in Economics, the College and the Harris School, Director of the Interdisciplinary Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, and Director of the Energy and Environment Lab at University of Chicago Urban Labs. Dr. Greenstone received his bachelor's degree in economics at Swarthmore College and his PhD in economics from Princeton. Our final witness today will be Dr. Patrick Michaels, Director of the Center for the Study of Science at the Cato Institute and contributing author to United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. Dr. Michaels received his bachelor's and master's degrees in biological sciences and plant ecology from the University of Chicago, and his PhD in ecological climatology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. I now recognize Dr. Gayer for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Chairs Biggs, LaHood, and Smith, and ranking members Bonamici and Beyer, and members of the subcommittees, I appreciate the opportunity to appear here today to discuss the social cost of carbon. The social cost of carbon is a dollar estimate of the damages caused by a 1-ton increase in greenhouse gas emissions in a given year. It is a conceptually valid and important consideration when devising policies and treaties to address climate change. Yet estimating the value of the social cost of carbon is an enormously complex and uncertain exercise. In 2009, the Obama administration established an interagency working group to develop a range of estimates for the social cost of carbon, subsequently used by agencies to evaluate federal regulations. My focus is on the specific question of whether the social cost of carbon should account for the global or the domestic harm of a ton of greenhouse gas. In a world in which the United States and all the other major emitters of greenhouse gases adopted a coordinated set of policies to address climate change, then a global measure would be appropriate, since greenhouse gases contribute to damages around the world no matter where they occur. But we don't live in such a world. Instead, in the U.S., we have opted for a suite of regulatory policies, ranging from subsidizing lower carbon energy sources, mandating energy efficiency levels in buildings, vehicles, and household appliances, requiring transportation fuels to contain minimum volumes of different renewable fuels, and restricting emissions from electric utilities. Given the diversity of regulations directed at climate change, it is useful and important for the agencies to coordinate on a single measure of climate benefits. But the question is whether they should report and consider the benefits to U.S. citizens or to the world. The interagency working group opted for a global measure. I believe the exclusive focus on a global measure runs counter to standard benefit cost practice, in which only the benefits within the political jurisdiction bearing the cost of the policy are considered. It also seems at odds with the expressed intent of longstanding executive orders and of authorizing statutes. For example, the main regulatory guidance document that has been in place for 20 years is Executive Order 12866, which makes clear that the appropriate reference point for analyzing federal regulatory policies is the U.S. citizenry, not the world. Similarly, when enacting the Clean Air Act, Congress stated that its purpose was to, quote, protect and enhance the quality of the nation's air resources so as to promote the public health and welfare and productive capacity of its population, end quote, which again suggests a focus on domestic benefits. The global measure is 4 to 14 times greater than the estimated domestic measure, which is significant. For example, for its proposed regulations for existing power plants, the EPA estimated climate benefits amounting to $30 billion in 2030. However, the estimated domestic climate benefits would have only amounted to $2 to $7 billion, which is less than EPA's estimated compliance costs for the rule. I believe that adopting a global measure for the benefits of a domestic policy would be justified if U.S. actions led to complete reciprocity from other countries. The question is whether efforts by the U.S. to regulate greenhouse gases might spur reciprocity by other countries to do so as well, generating domestic benefits that are 4 to 14 times as great as the direct domestic benefits to the U.S.-only policy. This is doubtful, since the agency regulations taken under existing U.S. laws, such as the Clean Air Act, are not tantamount to treaty commitments that can establish a formal basis for other countries matching the efforts undertaken domestically. By using the global social cost of carbon, the agencies are claiming that their rules provide benefits that in fact largely accrue to foreign citizens. Of course, many Americans are altruistic and care about the welfare of people beyond our borders, but foreign aid decisions should be made openly, not hidden in an obscure metric used in domestic rulemaking. A global measure of the social cost of carbon is appropriate if the intent is to use it to support the development of a global system of reducing greenhouse gases, such as through a worldwide carbon tax. I favor a carbon tax for the U.S. that replaces regulations and relies on border tax adjustments to incentivize other major emitters to follow suit. But absent such an approach, for domestic agencies considering domestic regulations in which the costs are incurred domestically, a global measure deviates from standard practice and requires more scrutiny and justification than it has received to date. At the very least, agencies should report the expected domestic benefits and only separately and transparently report the expected foreign benefits of their actions, informed by concrete evidence of reciprocity expected from other countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gayer. I now recognize Dr. Dayaratna for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Chairman Biggs, Ranking Member Bonamici, and other members of the subcommittees. Thank you for the opportunity to testify about the social cost of carbon. My name is Kevin Dayaratna. I'm the Senior Statistician and Research Programmer at the Heritage Foundation. The views I express in this testimony are my own and should not be construed as representing any official position of the Heritage Foundation. One of the primary metrics that the previous administration had used to justify agenda regarding energy policy, justify its regulatory agenda regarding energy policy, is the social cost of carbon, which is defined as the economic damages associated with a metric ton of carbon dioxide emissions summed across a particular time horizon. There are three primary statistical models that the Obama administration's interagency working group had used to estimate the SEC: the DICE model, the FUN model, and the PAGE model. My colleagues and I have used the DICE and FUN models, testing their sensitivity to a variety of important assumptions. Our work, published both at Heritage as well as in the peer-reviewed literature, has repeatedly illustrated that while these models might be interesting for academic exercises, they can be readily manipulated by regulators and bureaucrats. In particular, as with any statistical model, they're dependent on various assumptions. I'd like to discuss three assumptions regularly manipulated to achieve predetermined outcomes: the choice of a discount rate, a time horizon, and the specification of an equilibrium climate sensitivity distribution. The first easily manipulated assumption is the discount rate. In this type of cost-benefit analysis, the discount rate should reflect the rate of return on generally achievable alternative investments. The IWG had run these models using 2.5%, 3%, and 5% discount rates, despite the fact that OMB guidance in Circular A4 had specifically stipulated that a 7% discount rate be used as well. At Heritage, we re-estimated these models using a 7% discount rate and noticed drastic reductions to the SCC. In 2020, for example, according to our recent analysis of the DICE model published in the peer-reviewed journal Climate Change Economics, under a 3% discount rate, the SCC is estimated to cost $37.79 per ton, while under a 7% discount rate, it is estimated to be $5.87, an 84% reduction. The higher estimates previously found by the IWG can enable policymakers to justify unnecessary regulations and taxes on the economy. The second easily manipulated assumption is the specification of a time horizon. It is close to impossible to forecast what the economy will look like decades into the future. Foolishly, these models attempt to make projections not decades, but rather 3 centuries into the future. In my work at Heritage, I've changed a time horizon to a significantly shorter, but still unrealistic time horizon of 150 years into the future. With the DICE model, we find that these results plummet by 25% in some instances. The third readily manipulated variable is the model's equilibrium climate sensitivity, or ECS distribution, quantifying the Earth's temperature response to a doubling of carbon dioxide concentration. My colleague Dr. Pat Michaels will go into this in more detail, but the IWG used an ECS distribution that was published 10 years ago in the journal Science. Since then, a number of newer ECS distributions have been published, suggesting lower probabilities of extreme global warming. Using the more up-to-date ECS distributions generates significantly lower estimates of the SCC. In our peer-reviewed work, we found that as a result of updating the ECS distributions, the results drop by as much as 197% under some circumstances. Inflated estimates of climate sensitivity drive up the SCC, which can become manifested in unnecessary regulations. Finally, the unexplored issue here is, are there any benefits associated with carbon dioxide emissions? The answer is surprisingly yes. The FUN model actually allows for negative SCC, meaning a positive outcome. In fact, under some assumptions, there are actual substantial probabilities of negative SCC, meaning increased CO2 fertilization leading to increased agriculture and forestry yields. Moreover, if one were to take the IWG's interpretation of these models seriously and implement the associated regulations, there would be significant damage to the economy. In particular, our analysis finds that by 2035, the country would experience an average employment shortfall of 400,000 lost jobs, a marked increase in electricity prices, and an aggregate $2.5 trillion loss in GDP. Our analysis using the model of for the assessment of greenhouse gas-induced climate change has found that these devastating impacts would be accompanied by insignificant changes in less than 0.2 of a degree Celsius in temperature mitigation and less than 2 centimeters of sea level rise reduction. In conclusion, the SCC is a broken tool for regulatory policy, and taking it seriously would provide significant harm and little environmental benefit. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Dayaratna. I now recognize Dr. Greenstone for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
Thank you, Chairman Biggs and LaHood, Ranking Members Bonamici and Beyer, and members of the subcommittees for inviting me to speak today. My name is Michael Greenstone, and I'm the Milton Friedman Professor in Economics and Director of the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. The social cost of carbon is a monetized value that damages from the release of an additional ton of CO2. This means that it can be used to determine the benefits of regulations that reduce CO2 emissions, and indeed these benefits can then be compared to the costs that the regulations impose to determine whether the regulation is beneficial or not. In 2009, while working in the Obama administration, Cass Sunstein and I convened and co-led an interagency working group to determine a government-wide value for the social cost of carbon. Ultimately, the interagency working group determined a central estimate of $21 per metric ton. That estimate has since been revised to reflect scientific advances and is now about $36. The approach has been judged valid. Last August, the Federal Court of Appeals rejected a legal challenge to the metric. Further, the General Accounting Office has said that the working group's processes and methods reflected key principles that ensured its credibility. It used consensus-based decision-making, relied largely on existing academic literature and models, and disclosed limitations and incorporated new information by considering public comments and revising the estimates as updated research became available. Indeed, the social cost of carbon's credibility is underscored by the fact that it has been adopted by the governments of California, Illinois, Minnesota, Maine, New York, and Washington State, not to mention Canada and Mexico. Before concluding my testimony today, I would like to address two frequent critiques of the social cost of carbon. One such critique is that the real discount rates used, 2.5%, 3%, and 5%, are too low. Why is a discount rate so important? If we choose a discount rate that is too low, then we're going to pay too much for mitigation efforts today. If instead we choose one that's too high, then we're going to impose higher climate damages on our children and grandchildren than we intend. Economic theory tells us that we'll be best off if the discount rate is equal to the market interest rate from investments that match the structure of payoffs that climate mitigation provides. If we thought climate damages were likely to be imposed consistently and predictably over time, then it would be appropriate to set a discount rate equal to something like the average return for the stock market. That's about 5.3% over the last 50 years. But, on the other hand, if we think climate damages could be unpredictable and that tail risk points towards major losses, then markets themselves, tell us to use a lower discount rate. Consider the case of gold. Its average return is only about 3%, yet people hold it as an investment. Why is that? The reason is that it pays off dramatically during infrequent episodes of economic distress. For example, during the Great Recession, gold outperformed the stock market by 67%. When one considers the possibility of large temperature changes for given increases in emissions, great sea level rise in relatively short periods of time, the possibility of physical tipping points or human responses to these changes that include mass migration, then the case for using a low discount rate to determine the social cost of carbon appears strong. In addition to this conceptual reason to prefer low discount rates, the decline in global interest rates, so another market-based reason, since the mid-1980s provides another reason. The 3% real discount rate that has been a cornerstone of regulatory analysis since 2003 draws its justification from the fact that it was roughly equal to the real rate of return on long government debt at that time. However, the world has changed. Rates are now much lower, and indeed the comparable rate is now probably below 2%. Put another way, capital markets are trying to tell us to use discount rates that are lower than what are currently being used by to determine the social cost of carbon. A second criticism of the social cost of carbon is that it reflects global costs from emissions, but the United States should only be concerned with domestic damages. However, this criticism misses an important point, that the goal of policy is to maximize net benefits to Americans, and that recognizing foreign damages is likely to increase net benefits. Why is this the case? It's because each ton of CO2 emitted outside the United States inflicts damages on us. Thus, we benefit when China, India, the European Union, and others reduce their emissions. It absolutely strains credibility to assume that these countries' emissions cuts would be as large as if we reverted to a social cost of carbon based only on domestic damages. In many respects, the Paris Climate Agreement, where nearly 200 countries agreed to take action on carbon emissions, is a validation of the importance of treating climate change as a global problem. To summarize, society needs to balance the cost or economy of mitigating climate change with the coming climate damages. Wishing that we did not face this trade-off will not make it go away. Ultimately, we will be better off if a social cost of carbon based on sound science, economics, and law continues to serve as a linchpin of regulatory policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Greenstone. I'll now recognize Dr. Michaels for 5 minutes to present his testimony.
May we have the first image? Thank you. Mr. Chairman, ranking members, and members of the subcommittees.
Pat, is your mic on?
Thank you.
Mic's on.
Yes, if you.
Thank you for inviting my testimony on scientific problems relating to the current calculation of the social cost of carbon, or SCC. I am Patrick J. Michaels, Director of the Center for the Study of Science at the Cato Institute. Prior to that, I was a research professor of environmental sciences at University of Virginia for 30 years. A year and a half ago, I testified to the Committee on Natural Resources that the Obama administration's calculations of the SCC were in contravention of a large and growing body of scientific literature, next image, demonstrating that the sensitivity of temperature to human emissions of carbon dioxide is not nearly as large as was previously thought. And more important, the chance of a high-end warming has greatly diminished. Since then, the evidence has grown stronger. Climate sensitivity is the amount of net warming one gets for doubling atmospheric carbon dioxide. It also roughly approximates the forecast for surface warming for the 21st century. The Obama administration used a sensitivity specification by Rowe and Baker, which is the top line there, that had a mean sensitivity of 3.0 degrees C and a 5 to 95% confidence limit of 1.7 to 7.14 degrees C, a very large number. Beginning in 2011, all this work down here, a growing body of the scientific literature has yielded 32 new estimates of the sensitivity generated by more than 50 researchers from around the world, with a mean sensitivity of 2 degrees C and a 5 to 95% confidence limit of 1.1 to 3.5 degrees C. The large distributions of warming, next image, used in Rowe and Baker resulted in large part because of extremely wide range of estimates of the cooling effects of sulfate aerosols, another human emission. These were dramatically narrowed by researchers Nick Lewis and Judith Curry of Georgia Tech, which greatly reduced the sensitivity, as you can see here, and the spread around that sensitivity. As my colleague Kevin Dayaratna has shown, the newer, more reality-based estimates result in a dramatic lowering of the SCC. Next image. Let's now have a look at how well those climate models that were used to calculate the previous administration's SCC are doing. This illustration is a further update of an analysis initially presented in testimony of John Christie in 2015, with data that ended in 2014. The uptick in observed warming at the end of the record is an apparent improvement between the models and reality, but it is not. Instead, it is the 2015-2016 El Nino. Next image. And that spread is likely to widen again in recent years, as you can see from surface temperatures here, that they have dropped back down very close to their previous El Nino value. Next is a chart of predicted trends in tropical temperatures measured vertically. This is where the largest integrated warming on Earth is forecast to occur. The green line on the left is reality, which generally shows 2 to 3 times less warming than has been predicted. At the top of the active weather zone around here, the forecast is approximately 7 times less or 7 times more than is what is being observed. To deny this reality is to deny science. It is the vertical temperature distribution that largely determines daily weather. If this is forecast incorrectly, then any subsidiary forecasts of surface weather regimes are of little to no value. To deny that is to deny science. There is another systematic error in the previous calculations of the SCC. We live on a planet that is becoming greener because of the direct, next image, physiological effects of increasing carbon dioxide on plant photosynthesis. A massive survey of the scientific literature by Dr. Craig Idso shows this caused a $3.2 trillion increment in agricultural output from 1961 through 2011. My colleague, Mr. Dayaratna, has shown that a more realistic sensitivity and carbon dioxide fertilization can result in a negative SCC, or a net external benefit from the production of carbon dioxide. In closing, I provide you this image of the greening of our luke-warming home planet as taken by NASA satellites. Where there are dots, the changes are statistically significant. Note that the greatest increases, the ones in pink, are in the margins of the world's deserts and the tropical rainforest, places we all feared for. To acknowledge this is to affirm reality. Thank you very much for inviting my testimony.
Thank you. I thank each of the witnesses for their testimony today. The chair recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Dr. Gayer, because the interagency working group ignored Office of Management and Budget guidelines and used a global perspective in determining the SCC, agencies issue regulations with substantial domestic costs based on benefits to non-Americans. In what way does this this global perspective method of calculating the SCC potentially mislead the public?
So I'll answer in 2 parts. First, the models that are discussed here today are global models, so it's inordinately difficult for them to come up with domestic estimates. But the interagency review, interagency process did kind of benchmark it to 4 to 14 times differential. So the domestic benefits are 1/4 to 1/14 what the global benefits are based on the models that they use. And just to clarify, based on comment earlier, I think the approach should be taken if it is going to use a global measure. It's not a 0-1, right? You could use a domestic measure, or you can use a full global measure. Michael referred to straining credibility to assume that there's no global benefits. I think it strains credibility to suggest that there's going to be full global benefits, meaning if we act, the rest of the world will act instantaneously as well. So to the extent that that doesn't happen and we're using a domestic measure, we're overestimating the benefits. And the example I gave with the Clean Power Plan, on the climate benefits side, it's enough to tip the scales that the costs outweigh the benefits.
And Dr. Gayer, just to follow up, do agencies have a duty to inform the American public of the domestic benefits and the cost-benefit analysis for federal regulations?
Yes, and those are the OMB guidelines. As I suggested at the end, I think I'd be less kind of worked up over it if they did both, but they should lead with the domestic measure.
Dr. Dayaratna, what are your biggest concerns about using the SCC in policymaking?
Yeah. Thank you for the question, Congressman. So there are a variety of issues with these SCCs, with these IAMs associated with these SCCs. The most fundamental issue is that they're extremely sensitive to very, very reasonable changes in assumptions. As I was referring to, using the time horizon to 300 years, if you shift that to 150 years, which is still unrealistic, you get a drastically different estimate of the SCC. The discount rate, if you use a 7% discount rate as mandated by the OMB, under the fund model, you will get a negative social cost of carbon. And the policy implication there would be that we shouldn't be taxing carbon dioxide emissions, but subsidizing it. Then lastly, with the equilibrium climate sensitivity distributions, the ECS distribution used was published 10 years ago, and it's not even based on empirical research. More up-to-date ECS distributions also will result in a substantially lower and even potentially negative SCC, depending on the model that you use. So with these results all over the map, I do not understand how policymakers can garner any meaningful advice for regulatory policy.
So just for the laymen who are here, what does the negative value of SEC connote? I mean, what are we really saying there when we say negative value?
Basically, in a nutshell, in general, when people think of SEC, they talk about economic damages associated with carbon dioxide emissions. When those damages are negative, that implies that the SEC actually provides benefits. And the result of that is, mostly increased photosynthesis, agriculture, and so forth. But that would suggest that increased CO2 is actually good for the planet.
Thank you. Dr. Michaels, in 2015, the Interagency Working Group released a report to the public comments on the determination of the social cost of carbon. You were one of the commenters. What is the significance of having a comment period in the process of developing an SCC, and did the Interagency Group adopt any of these comments?
No, they did not. And many of the comments were well-reasoned based upon recent peer-reviewed literature reinforcing the notion that the sensitivity of temperature that was used in the models was too high. Nature is trying to tell us something. If you look at that satellite image that I showed earlier, you can see that the observed warming in the lower atmosphere is about half of what was predicted. If you look in the tropics, you can see that the observed warming in the vertical in the tropics is about half, actually maybe even a little bit less than what was predicted. All these things point to a consistent story. About twice as much warming was predicted as is going to occur. Now, the UN's mean sensitivity is 3.2 degrees Celsius. Why don't we settle this out at 1.6? And everybody can go home, because we're going to meet the 2-degree guideline with business as usual, declare victory, and let's go on.
So when the report refused to adopt any of the comments, what does it say to the validity of the report and its objectivity?
I would say that they were wedded to a point of view, and I understand. I live in Washington. I understand the pressures in this town. If anyone gave an official answer that this was not a problem, I hate to say, we probably wouldn't be chatting here so amiably, because nobody would care.
Thank you, Dr. Michaels. I recognize Ranking Member Bonamici for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Greenstone, it's been suggested that the Interagency Working Group operated under some sort of veil of secrecy while developing the social cost of carbon. The GAO, in a 2014 report, found that many of the social cost of carbon estimates were developed with input from the public. Now, you and Cass Sunstein convened and led this Interagency Working Group. So did the Interagency Working Group hear concerns that were raised by the other witnesses today? And how were those considered in the process? And can you also talk about the role that public comment played in the development of the social cost of carbon?
Yeah, thank you, Congresswoman, for letting me talk about that. So it's probably worth going back in time a little bit. The social cost of carbon was developed in a very methodical way. We convened and led this group that met many times, that it drew expertise from agencies across the administration. We then first put out was a interim number that was put out for public comment. Then the final number of $21 was released in 2010. That has been attached to, I think, approximately 80 different rules. Public comment was received on that through that process. And then the administration later, I think in 2013, just put it out for public comment by itself. So there was tremendous effort to engage the public. There was tremendous effort to draw expertise from all corners of government, and it was a highly technical exercise that led to what we perceive to be, and I believe to be, describing the frontier of science. Now, it is possible that some of my fellow witnesses feel spurned, and I think that's why we often use peer-reviewed literatures to determine what's true and what's not true. And I think just because their ideas were not judged to be on the frontier does not mean that the whole process was flawed.
Thank you. And Dr. Greenstone, just because a comment is made and received but not included does not mean it was not considered, correct?
Indeed.
So Dr. Greenstone, Dr. Dayaratna said that if the social cost of carbon was implemented, the country would suffer, I believe it was, he said, disastrous economic consequences, including a loss of jobs and income and an increase in electricity prices. I'd like you to address what would happen if, indeed, the Trump administration has been promoting energy policies without regard to what the policies may do to the environment. So will you explain what would happen if we were to roll back regulations designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, if there's an economic price to pay for undermining the science supporting the social cost of carbon and environmental regulations, and also how would other countries like China or India respond if the United States retreats from, or even appears to be retreating from, its obligations to address greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, so I think Dr. Dayaratna is making a very important point, which is that regulations have costs. So we should all agree on that, and we should we can move on. On the flip side of that is that regulations to reduce carbon emissions have benefits. And it's a trade-off, like many things in economics. There's no free lunch. And, you know, if we were to roll back regulations on climate emissions or carbon emissions, the world would face, and certainly the United States would face higher temperatures, it would face sea level rise, it would face a variety of risks that would impose costs on us, our children, and our grandchildren. And let me just also return, you also asked, Congresswoman, about how it would be perceived globally if we revert it to a domestic social cost of carbon. And I think that's an important question, because it's not a narrative here about using the domestic damages only, I think misses that this is an international problem. And in particular, when, as I said in my testimony, when China or India or the EU reduces emissions, it gives great benefits to the citizens of the United States. And to not account for that leverage puts us at risk of higher costs. And so I think the case for reverting to a domestic-only damage is essentially asking the rest of the world to ramp up their emissions.
And finally, I know the recent National Academy of Sciences report valuing climate damages, updating estimation of the social cost of carbon, provides some recommendations to the interagency working group on how to improve the methodology. Do the recommendations for an updated estimation undermine the current working group values of the social cost of carbon, or would using the Academy's recommendation methodology invalidate existing regulations?
No,
that
thank you for that question. I think rather than have people cherry pick particular features, which seems to be what's happening today, that they dislike or that they know can change the social cost of carbon, a methodical and scientific approach would be to follow the National Academy of Sciences recommendations. And indeed, in the interagency working group, we suggested that as science advanced, the numbers should be updated periodically. And the National Academy of Sciences report gives a terrific blueprint that would allow for updating. And, you know, it is true, things have advanced since 2009 and 2010. Our understanding about the impacts of climate change, for instance, on human mortality have greatly advanced. And I expect that following the NAS's blueprint would allow for a refresh.
Thank you. My time has expired. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Dr. Michaels, you wish to respond?
Yeah, I think it's time to actually take a good, clear look at the effect of policies with regard to the Paris Agreement. The EPA uses a model called the Model for the Assessment of Greenhouse Gas-Induced Climate Change, and if you're following, the acronym for that model is MAGIC. It is the standard tool that is used, and you can put in emissions scenarios, climate sensitivity, and come out with a temperature saving as a result of any given policy. So let's assume a sensitivity that is probably too high, 3 degrees Celsius, and let's reduce United States emissions to 0 right now through the year 2100. The amount of warming that would be prevented would be between 1/10 and 2/10 of a degree Celsius. Now let's talk about China and India candidly, rather than merely using adjectives and adverbs. The Chinese emission commitments at the Paris Agreement are nothing but business as usual. It has long been recognized as their economy matures that their emissions will stabilize around 2030, and that is precisely what they said they would do. The Indian commitment is less than nothing. As economies mature, the amount of CO2 you emit per unit GDP declines. It's called an increase or a decrease in emissions intensity. They vowed in Paris to decrease their emissions intensity less, underline less, than the business as usual scenario for the country of India. So really, what we do doesn't mean anything to these other countries because they're not doing anything. Thank you.
I recognize Chairman of the Oversight Committee, LaHood, for his 5 minutes questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank all the witnesses for being here today and your valuable testimony. Dr. Gayer, I wanted to ask you, you know, as we try to better understand what Congress and the Trump administration can do to make agency rulemaking based on a more accurate and accurate cost and benefit information, I do have concerns. I'm not sure whether you're familiar. Last year, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, the federal jurisdiction, ruled in a unanimous decision basically against the petitioners, which was a organization by the name of Zero Zone, which is an air conditioning and heating unit that sued the Department of Energy based on the rulemaking process. And that unanimous decision, their conclusion, and I'm summarizing here, but the DOE conducted a cost-benefit analysis that is within the statutory authority and is supported by substantial evidence. Its methodology and conclusions were not arbitrary or capricious. And I guess, do you have concerns that the court did not criticize this process in this court case?
Thank you for the question. I feel like I'm in a funny position in many ways. If you locked me and Michael Greenstone in a room, I'm not sure that we'd come up with a very different policy outcome. But I think the process of getting there matters, and I think the regulatory process that was used did involve a lot of assumptions and complexities that I would say lean into arbitrary considerations. That's not to say I think that the social cost of carbon, this true number out there, is negative. I don't, and as I alluded to in my testimony, I do think we should act. I just don't think we should act through kind of the mechanisms of existing statutes, through regulations that take a very piecemeal approach, and to my mind, sort of put a veneer of scientific legitimacy on something that I think is highly, highly uncertain. So that's a long-winded way of me getting at your question, so I apologize. Yes, I'm concerned when the courts disagree with me to some degree. I don't know what, you know, in the kind of motivation of your question, we are existing in a world where all the action on climate is happening under existing statutes and therefore going through the agencies. And so to the extent that there's too much focus on global, not domestic, I do think it's addressable from Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs and guidance given to the agencies about how they should conduct this. I don't want to speak for other people on the panel, but I think there is a lot of discretion in the choices that were made in how we come up with these numbers. I don't think it was kind of rigged or deception or manipulated. I just think that people disagree, and I think with the new administration and a new OMB and OIRA director, they can come to a different determination of how much to weight global versus domestic, as well as issues like discount rates and others, which is a highly difficult, complex, in many ways ethical question.
Well, thank you for that. And just as a follow-up, I think in your opening testimony, you went through kind of you described it as a suite of regulatory policies that we put in place domestically that, you know, have worked fairly well with reducing some of those environmental concerns that people talked about. In terms of a public policy position here in Congress on what we should do, beyond what you said with working in the administration, any recommendations for us here in terms of legislation, what we should look at to address this problem?
Well, I think I have a kind of classic view perhaps on this. I first approached this problem because I thought a lot of these regulations, not because I didn't think climate change was a problem, but I thought these regulations were a much too costly way to go about doing it. And in the analysis that they were used to justify it, I thought they were, in some sense, making decisions I disagreed with to make them look better than they are. I testified, actually, at the House a few years ago. A lot of these regulations are justified not on environmental grounds, but because they purport to save consumers money, because the underlying thesis there is that consumers are kind of irrational in their consumption decisions, so therefore, you know, the regulator has to come and make the decision for them, which is, to my mind, a kind of a dangerous assumption and shouldn't be used to justify rules. I have the kind of minority opinion on what should be done, but I think it should go through Congress. As I said before, favor kind of a trade for a carbon tax on one side that's revenue neutral, meaning affording a tax cut and also lighter regulation so that we're not going through the regulatory approach as we currently have been.
Thank you. Those are all my questions.
Thank you. I recognize Mr. Byer for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Thank you all very much for being here. It's fun to have 3 economists and mathematicians, which we don't often get, and a bona fide PhD climatologist. I want to thank all of you for recognizing that climate change is in fact real. You may have different notions of is it as fast as it was, but this is a great leap forward for the committee and for America. And I'm particularly pleased that Dr. Greenstone is the Milton Friedman Professor of Economics, which would make all of my Republican friends very comfortable and happy. And thank Dr. Gayer for the quote that says that the social cost of carbon is a conceptually valid and important consideration when devising policies and treaties to address climate change. Dr. Greenstone, the 2 things that have come up again and again, in fact, our chairman's opening statement was, number 1, this whole notion of the appropriate discount rate. And you said, you quoted, the appropriate discount rate comes down to a judgment about whether climate change involves a substantial risk of being disruptive. Now, the OMB has a circular that says we should use 7%. Why the decision to ignore the 7%? Can you give us simply, again, why we would choose a number like 3% rather than a 7%?
Yes, thank you for your question, Mr. Congressman. So the discount rate is Dr. Gayer mentioned, it's a very tough issue. With respect to climate change, or with respect to any public investment, what one would like to do is to use a discount rate where that reflects an interest rate from the market where the payoffs from that investment are similar to the payoffs from climate mitigation. And if you think, when you start to think about what climate change might offer, and a lot of it is unknown, as you put it, it could be very disruptive, that would tend to push people to lower discount rates and lower interest rates. And as I said in my testimony, the example of gold is really a good one in the sense that people are willing to hold gold. It has a very low mean rate of return of about 3%. But the reason they're willing to hold it is because it pays off when times are bad. And so if we end up with a bad state of the world with respect to climate, I think that would push us to having wished we'd use the low discount rate. It's also worth noting that we're having a somewhat artificial discussion about the 3% and 7%. Those were set in 2003 when global capital markets looked extraordinarily different than they do today. If we were to instead use what global capital markets are trying to tell us now, the 3% number would very likely be below 2%. That is, that's the return on a long-term government bond. That is the real return. The real return is probably less than 2%, to be honest. And the 7% number would also be much lower as well. So ultimately, we chose to go with 3% and 5% to reflect the character of the climate problem.
Okay, great, thanks. The second half of that is that there apparently, according to the majority memo, longstanding OMB guidance to only consider the domestic cost benefits. And Dr. Gayer, I think, went on pretty eloquently about, you know, we're considering what's happening around the world, but they're not necessarily affecting their policies. How would you justify the notion of using a global measure of the impacts?
Yeah. So actually, so let's establish that I'm not a lawyer, and how nice it was to hear that there was people were interested in having economists in the room. So that was a surprise. But my understanding of OMB Circular 4, which is what we're talking about, is that it leaves open the option to look at global effects, and that was the path that we drove on. Now, I'm not the legal expert. The second thing that I want to come back to, and I thought it was very interesting, I saw some light between mine and Dr. Gayer's testimony there, which is that I think to do an analysis of the benefits of carbon regulations that ignore the leverage from emissions reductions inside the United States, and that leverage comes in the form of emissions reductions in other countries, I think is an extraordinarily incomplete analysis. And using the global number is one way, and I think a valid way, to reflect that leverage.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Dr. Michaels, congratulations on your Nobel Prize.
I didn't say that. That went to the group.
Okay, well,
people
still.
Up there, certainly not to the worker bees.
You know, so There was the group that came up with the 2% target, I think.
2 degree target.
2 degree target, 2 degree target.
That
Now
was-
you're thinking that we're going to be more like 1.6. Will you be part of the IPC going forward, and will they come to a 1.6 consensus in the next couple of years?
The numbers that I have always given in my decades of testifying in front of both the House and the Senate are all within the range of the IPCC consensus. So there's nothing new here.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Can I just add
Thank
one?
you.
I believe the IPCC
Dr.
consensus
Greenstone, please.
is from 1.5 to 4, or is it
Yeah,
1.5 to 4?
I believe 1.6
you're right at the
is in
bottom
there.
of the range, yeah.
Yes.
But I think the IPCC consensus is actually, you're right at the bottom of that range.
I recognize.
Just make sure we're all on the same page.
I recognize Chairman Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Dayaratna, let me address my first question to you, and it is this. Do you feel that the social cost of carbon is based upon legitimate science, or is it based upon arbitrary figures and subjective reasoning?
That's a very interesting question. So, thank you, Congressman. In terms of the science, so as Pat and I both alluded to, the ECS, the Equilibrium Climate Sensitivity Distribution that is implemented in these models by the IWG, it was published 10 years ago in the journal Science. That is a whole decade ago, and it is not even empirically estimated. It was calibrated to a priori assumptions that the IWG wanted to use regarding climate change. Now, if you look at the more recent distributions, you will notice significantly lower probabilities of extreme global warming. So what ended up happening was that using this outdated distribution, there was an overstated probability of extreme global warming, and that gets manifested in higher estimates of the SCC. So basically, the SCC estimates were essentially beefed up.
Okay, thank you. And Dr. Michaels, are there benefits to carbon emissions, and if so, should they be factored into the social cost?
Well, if you're going to factor costs, you should factor benefits, and the increment just from direct carbon dioxide fertilization for agricultural production is about $3 trillion from 1961 through 2011. But more importantly, the satellite data shows a remarkable greening of the planet Earth. And the illustration that I showed earlier is remarkably reassuring, because the massive greenings, the largest greenings, are occurring in the margins of the Great Desert, the Sahelian region in Africa that you and I were taught in school. This is desertifying and it will never come back. Right. The tropical rainforest, the lungs of the earth, have the largest increase in greening on the planet, all brought to you by carbon dioxide. So, yeah, you should factor those things in, I would think. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Michaels, for that. One other question. What are some important climate change factors that are not accounted for in the social cost?
Oh, God. How many hours do I have to answer that?
How about a minute and a half?
Okay.
Okay.
One of the problems is that we spend tremendous amounts of taxpayer money on climate models.
Okay.
And very, very models for what happens when you increase carbon dioxide, and very, very little money on what's called natural climate variability. We know there are these great oscillations in the Atlantic and the Pacific that drive, modulate hurricanes, modulate storm tracks, modulate weather. Those things are not simulated in these climate models, and we need to understand that variability and subtract that out. I'll close in 1 second here. The warming of the late 20th century, which began in 1976 and either ended in 1998 or continued attenuated after 1998, depending upon what we believe, is the same magnitude as the warming of the early 20th century that occurred between 1910 and 1945. That warming could not have been caused by carbon dioxide.
Right.
It means that natural variability is as large as the largest human signal, and yet we only model the human signal. What's wrong with this picture, Congressman?
Yeah. That last point, the last couple of points, you seldom see covered in the media, but I think they're great points to make. Final question is, should we be using the social cost at all?
We should use the social cost of carbon if it's accurately calculated, and I think there's a lot of debate about what we're supposed to, what it comprises, and what the natural variability component of it is, and all this good stuff. We're just not there. It's not ready for prime time, Congressman.
Thank you, Dr. Michaels. You are back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I recognize Chairman LaHood.
Mr. Chairman, I would just like, I forgot to submit a document for the record from the American Road and Transportation Builders Association regarding our hearing today. I would ask to submit it for the record.
Without objection. Chair recognizes Mr. McInerney.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding the hearing. Thank the witnesses this morning. Dr. Gare, I'm very pleased to hear that you support a carbon tax. I think that's the way to go. I'm going to be proposing a carbon tax and benefit package a little bit later, and I hope to get your support on that. Can we follow through with that?
I'd be delighted to, yes.
Very good. About the domestic versus international impacts, do you believe that the physical impacts of climate change on other nations don't have an impact on our domestic economy or security?
No, I don't believe that, but what I believe is that the actions that we've taken thus far won't lead to reductions matched throughout the entire world. And there are many policies that we have outside of environmental or climate that that if other countries did the same thing, I mean, you can think about foreign aid or any number of policies, the world would be a better place and we'd benefit perhaps from it, but we don't take those benefits into account. So regulations
if we drop out of the Clean Power Plan and the Paris agreements, then that's not going to have an impact on China or India or any of the other countries that are big emitters?
I don't think the Clean Power Plan, well, I don't know that the Clean Power Plan would have an effect. If there's an international agreement and a treaty that is binding, then certainly we should consider the global benefits. Absent that, an EPA regulation I don't think will actually lead to realized effects throughout the world, and certainly not 100% throughout the world.
So you do think that climate change is the problem?
Sure, yes, yes.
And that the United States should have a leadership role in this issue?
Yes.
Thank you. Dr. Greenstone, what impact will limiting the SCC have on current future environmental protections designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions? How is that going to affect us if we eliminate that measure?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it will increase emissions. Of course, it would naturally increase emissions in the United States, and that would increase the rate of climate change and global warming. What I think, the point I've been trying to make that I just want to underscore, is I think it would also increase emissions in other countries. And so there would be a multiplier effect. And I think it's a mistake to conclude that the Paris Agreement did not reflect U.S. leadership and did not reflect that the United States had adopted a robust climate policy. You know, let me also add, there's, I think, again, a surprising agreement on this panel, at least among two of us, that, that there is climate change. Climate change is real, and there seemed to be a little disagreement on the tactics. You know, our other two witnesses here, I think, are much more focused on cherry-picking particular features of it, and I think I couldn't agree with them more that updating the assumptions that underlie the social cost of carbon based on the advances in science in the last 7 or 8 years is an important thing to do. And indeed, thankfully, the National Academies of Science has put out a very clear report on how to go about doing that.
Thank you. Now, some of the critics have implied that the SCC is created by the Obama administration and pushed by environmentalists, but it's my understanding that the Reagan administration first demanded the federal government to do a cost-benefit analysis, and the federal courts required the George W. Bush administration to monetize these benefits. Is there any other way to do that than using a social cost of carbon?
No, really what the courts were requiring that a social cost of carbon be developed. And I think when one thinks back to 2009, what was striking is that even though a ton of CO2, wherever it's emitted in the U.S. economy, has the same impact, you had a complete discordant approach. Some departments were treating it as if there were zero costs associated with it, which is, just to be clear, effectively implying that climate change has no negative impacts.
Right.
And others were effectively treating it as if it were infinity costs. And so I think landing at the approach and the number that we ended tried to instill some discipline and coherence across policy across the government.
And so what's the context of how this came about, how this measure came about?
Yeah, no, it was sorry, the court had required it, and the president had ordered that a number be developed, and that, as I mentioned earlier, that used expertise from all branches of government.
And this was done in a transparent fashion?
It was done in transparent fashion. There's been endless opportunities for public comment. It's been at least 80 rules. In addition, it was put out for public comment on its own.
Is there some kind of consensus on what parameters to use for this model?
Yes, so there was great debate about it, and what a rule that I tried to impose when we were leading the process was that we should not be making science. We are, after all, faceless bureaucrats sitting in a room, but instead that our job was to summarize the frontier of science, and I feel that we were quite faithful to that goal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Dr. Michaels, you look like you might want to respond to the assertion of cherry picking.
No, I would like to, sorry.
Please, yeah.
I would like to respond to the assertion that without the social cost of carbon, that our emissions would go up. That's what I call maybe herd reasoning, and I'd like to show you how well herd reasoning works with regard to emissions. This, which I just happen to be carrying in my backpack, is a shale oil rock. 10 years ago, if I said that there were hundreds of years of oil, shale gas rather, which produces half the emissions of carbon dioxide when combusted for power production under our feet, polite company, and we would get it by exploding rocks, polite company would have laughed me out of every Washington cocktail hour. But that's the way people work. Regulation is not required to create efficiency. Markets are required to create efficiency. This is cheaper than its competitors, and emissions will continue to go down as long as our economy is free, for the simple reason that the future belongs to the efficient.
So you're saying industry can be relied on to clean itself up. That's basically what...
No, the market can be relied upon to clean up industry.
Mr. Greenstone.
So I'm sorry, the gentleman's time has expired.
I'm sorry.
Chair recognizes Mr. Posey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As policymakers, I think it's important that we all know what we don't know. And therefore, our attempts to predict the future impact of regulations are always speculative and subject to error. And that being said, it's also true that some predictions are more speculative and uncertain than others. The time between the implementation of a regulation and the onset of any potential benefits is a great example of a factor that makes some forecasts more reliable and others less so. Clearly, the longer the period of time is between the implementation of a rule and the realization of its benefits, the less reliable the analysis of the predicted benefits can be due to the increased likelihood of intervention from unforeseen sources. My first question is for Dr. Dayaratna. With what I've said in mind, can you give me an idea of the time horizon used in calculating the social cost of carbon? How far into the future are we looking at when we talk about this cost?
The time horizon for computing the social cost of carbon by the IWG is 300 years into the future. And it's interesting that you asked that question, Congressman. Firstly, it's difficult to forecast what the economy will look like, even a couple decades in the future, let alone centuries. Now, Dr. Michaels had a slide about the temperature projections that John Christie talked about, juxtaposing the IPCC's forecast versus satellite and weather balloon data. And I just find it astounding that people would want to use these models to try to make forecasts 300 years into the future when they can't even predict 20.
Yeah, we have trouble getting the weather predicted a day ahead of time.
Oh, absolutely.
So, wow, you're telling me we're basing our regulatory decisions on assumptions about what the world will be like in 300 years. in some ways, that's kind of like our founding fathers trying to predict and regulate the internet.
Yeah, I gave a talk, a couple weeks ago on this topic. John Adams once said America will one day become the greatest empire in the world. And he was right, but yet he'd have no idea what people are doing today using microphones, smartphones, tablets, and so forth. Similarly, we have no idea what things are going to look like that far into the future, and I quite frankly find these models are quite foolish in actually trying to make those types of forecasts.
Okay, can you describe for us how the social cost of carbon estimates change when you use a more reasonable horizon?
So, as I was referring to in my testimony, they change by a reasonable figure is around 25%. That figure varies, but on average around 25% or so, perhaps more.
And given what you just said, do you think it's advisable to continue using the current social cost of carbon estimates in rulemaking proceedings?
Absolutely not. I think these models, they're interesting for academic exercises, but they need to be revised to be suitable for regulatory policy.
Do you think in the future the agencies can and should be more forthcoming about the highly speculative nature and variable quality of social cost of carbon estimates?
I tend to think so, yes. To be quite honest, like the sheer fact that they are using an ECS distribution that is 10 years old and not even based on empirical research is one thing that is just not in detail talked about. In the IWG's analysis. They did respond to this in the public comments, I will say that. But yeah, there's so many other things out there that they should be more forthcoming about. And there was a question that came up earlier about the use of a 7% discount rate and why it was not used. Quite frankly, here's the reason why I think it wasn't used. Even using the outdated Rowe-Baker distribution, you still get a negative estimate of the SCC under a 7% discount rate. Okay. That's why it wasn't used.
Okay. Been a lot of discussion about climate change. Can anyone on the panel give me a date certain, even a year certain, that there was absolutely no climate change on this planet since the forming of it?
I believe that the climate has been changing since the planet was first formed.
Others?
Mr. Congressman, are you talking about, just so we're on the same page, are you talking about climate changing or climate changing due to the release of CO2? Because I can't quite tell from your question.
I thought I was fairly clear.
Okay.
Can you give me any date certain
the climate has
in the
been
history of the
changing,
Earth that the climate has not changed?
Since the release of CO2, it has been changing more rapidly.
That's not true.
Yeah, that's speculative, and I didn't ask you to describe a clock. I asked you if you knew what time it was. Yes, sir, Dan.
I think the climate was quite stable about 1 year before the Big Bang.
Okay, Dr. Dayaratna.
Yeah, there was actually a paper published in the Journal of the American Statistical Association last year that looked at tree ring analysis in Tomersåk, Sweden. And they found interestingly, using their Bayesian modeling, that in 1750, the temperatures there may have been just as warm, if not warmer, than they were today. In 1750, before, all the things that people tend to complain about today.
Yeah, any idea what the temperature was pre the last ice age when the dinosaurs were roaming the Earth?
Pat actually might have an answer to that.
The answer, that's a very good question, and I'm glad you asked that. I don't think we have to go pre the last ice age. Let's go not to the most recent interglacial, but to the penultimate one, the one between what some people call the Illinois glaciation and the Wisconsin glaciation. At the end of the current ice age, the temperatures got quite a bit warmer than they are now, the beginning of the current interglacial. The beginning of the penultimate one, they were much warmer than they were in our interglacial. In Greenland, temperatures in summer averaged around 6 degrees Celsius higher than now for 6,000 years. And guess what? The vast majority of the ice on Greenland survived, a heat load that human beings could not put on Greenland if they tried. And then somebody found a skeleton of a bear from 5,000 years before that, and it turns out the DNA sequence was that of a polar bear.
Thank you. Gentleman's time has
Thank you very
expired.
much.
Thank you. Chair recognizes my friend from Florida, Mr. Christ.
Thank you very much. Good morning. I was wondering, Dr. Michaels?
Hello.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm good.
Do you believe that climate change is real?
Of course.
Fabulous.
I also believe the sun will rise tomorrow.
That's breathtaking.
I know, it's mind-boggling.
What would you estimate is the cause of the climate change you believe in?
There are natural causes and there's a human component. You have to understand, the warming of the second warming in the 20th century is accompanied by a cooling of the lower stratosphere. Now, if you change the greenhouse effect, because you change the upwelling flux of infrared radiation, you will warm the lower layers of the atmosphere, but you will cool the stratosphere. That's what Karl Popper would call a difficult test of a theory. And indeed, the lower stratosphere cools concurrent with the warming of the troposphere, our neck of the woods. That's a greenhouse signature. But here's the cool part, Congressman Christ. In 1997, 1998, everybody knows that something happened to warming, unless you really jimmy the records, and it either slowed down or stopped.
Attenuated, you said.
Attenuated is a good word, because you can attenuate
your
a
word.
lot, or you can attenuate a little. But the stratospheric cooling also stopped. Now, if you want me to explain that, I'm going to tell you the three most important words in life.
My question is simple. What causes climate change, in your estimation?
Lots of things.
What's the primary cause?
The fact that we live on a fluid, discontinuous Earth with long-period oscillations. I mean, the biggest climate change that you and I know of is an ice age oscillation. And I don't think CO2 is going to be capable of doing that. And those occurred, you know, without human influence. Again, I say the warming of the late 20th century has a greenhouse component because of the stratospheric cooling. But why the stratosphere stopped cooling when the surface warming either stopped or attenuated? You know what the answer why that happened is?
May I ask another member a question?
No one knows is the answer.
Dr. Greenstone, what do you think causes climate change? Please.
I think what we're here to talk about today is the climate change is caused from the release of CO2, of
Yes,
which
sir.
I think that's a settled issue scientifically. And I can't help but note the contrast here between the concerns that the development of the FCC was an opaque process, which is the claims here. Let me just say the character of the conversation that occurred in those many, many meetings was really quite sober. It was rigorous. It was very scientifically based. And at no point did anyone talk about a skeleton of a polar bear as a way to make an argument. And my own view is that there's a great path forward, and I think there's agreement in the room that there should be a development, that the social cost of carbon should be refreshed to reflect the scientific advances that have occurred since 2009 and 2010. And literally, the National Academies of Sciences has outlined a terrific way forward that would also be rigorous, scientifically based, and sober. And I think there's a great opportunity for the Trump administration to do that.
Thank you. I'm from the Sunshine State, and I'm very proud of that. But having said that, we use less solar energy than New Jersey. And New Jersey is a great place, but it's the Garden State and we're the Sunshine State. And so the point I'm trying to make is if we're going to address climate change and probably the primary cause, which is CO2, carbon, then wouldn't it be better for us to try to get more of our energy from solar, from sun or wind in order to mitigate the cause?
I think there's a great case for energy markets being in a very unlevel playing field. In particular, the fossil fuels, which involve the release of CO2, when we go to the gas pump or when we pay our electricity bill, we don't pay for the climate damages that are associated with using them. If we were to level the playing field so that all sources of energy could compete on equal grounds, it would naturally be the case that there would be a greater reliance on, as you suggested, renewables, probably on nuclear as well, and other low-carbon energy sources.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Rohrbach from California.
Thank you very much, and let me just note that one of my colleagues suggested that there is a consensus among scientists that global warming is being caused by CO2 emissions. And let me just note that a consensus may mean 75%, it may mean 60%, it may mean 10%, and the others don't know for sure. But consensus is not how you determine whether or not something is scientifically viable. You have to really look to see whether or not it makes sense what people are saying, and whether or not, for example, attempts to receive government contracts for research were in some way influencing someone to target their outcome of their research. Because we have heard, what I have heard in the last few years, that droughts are caused, in California, droughts are caused by global warming and the CO2 level, and then now it's floods are caused by CO2 level, and more tornadoes. How many times have we heard that the tornadoes and the hurricanes are more frequent, but they're not? You know, come to find out, they are not more frequent. And all of this comes back to CO2 and whether or not it is something that we should be concerned about at the level of CO2. And let me just, you know, I drove across the country last year and I saw all of these hothouses where these covered up places with, and they were growing all sorts of vegetables. And I went and stopped at several of them. And guess what they were pumping into the hothouses? CO2. Now, why? Because it makes the plants grow better, and that means there's more food. Now, let me ask you this. If we have less CO2 in the air, does that mean that the plants, and I think we saw something there, that the plants will not grow as robustly if we have less CO2 in the air? Whoever wants to go into that.
That is actually one of the aspects about the fund model compared to the other models that has actually incorporated the feedback from CO2 into plants and agriculture from CO2 fertilization. So the other models, the Dice and Page model that the IWG used, do not account for this type of feedback.
So that's a great benefit if we have trees that are growing stronger and more trees, more edible plants growing stronger, but that benefit was not calculated into the cost benefit of other studies.
That benefit was incorporated in the fund model analysis. Out of the 3 models used by the IWG, the fund model actually incorporated that benefit. And you know, Pat can talk more about this, but there are other benefits in there that could potentially be modeled that, you know, the fund model doesn't take into account, such as, say, aquatic life, you know, detailed aspects about vegetation, detailed aspects about agriculture, and so forth, that the economy could benefit from.
Well, it's let me just put it this way. It's clear that in the past there were higher levels of CO2 and great plant life throughout the planet, and we know that. And that's very easily discovered in any research. But now our CO2 level is looked at as it's going to be harmful, and let me just say that I don't think that there is a consensus at a high level of percentage, and I think we need to make sure that before we jump into international agreements, that it's not just whether it's global benefit or whether it's local benefit. We just have to see whether there's any validity to this concept in the first place.
Congressman, could I offer an observation?
Please do.
I understand that it is thought to be socially responsible to pay for the costs of emissions of carbon dioxide. And I also would argue that the fossil fuel-driven societies since 1900 in the developed world have increased their lifespan by 100% and their per capita wealth 11-fold. Are we to not also take into account that massive benefit? We should all be dead, given our ages in this room, if this were 1900. But it is that society that allows us to live.
That was
Thank
a very
you.
good point, and I'm glad I'm not dead. There you go.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Marshall from Kansas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wish my colleague from Florida was still here. I was going to share with him that we have more sunny days in Kansas than there are. Oh, you are still here, Governor. So we have more sunny days in Kansas than Florida. So we look forward to continuing the diversity of energy from Kansas. So thanks for sharing that. I want to acknowledge a good friend of mine, John Francis, who's in the audience, flew all the way in from Great Bend, America to hear our president speak. Mr. Geyer, the first question's for you. You mentioned that you would be in favor of a carbon tax being implemented. Would you, if we implemented a carbon tax, do you think we could also do away with some of the regulations governing all these carbon producers and just let us pay a tax and be done with it if we could measure it some way?
Yeah, so certainly, in many ways, that's the kind of the thrust of my critique of what's going on in the regulatory sphere. Michael Greenstone mentioned leveling the playing field, and so for me, the carbon tax is the way to level the playing field, and the regulatory interventions that we've had are a very, very flawed approach to trying to do that. And in my view, the modeling and the global versus domestic are sort of justifications for what I think is a flawed approach. So, you know, the ultimate trade is a carbon tax in exchange for a tax reduction for more harmful taxes and less regulation, and just stick to the pricing.
Anybody else want to weigh on that? Dr. Greenstone, please.
Yeah, I think there's a great opportunity for applying a carbon tax at an appropriate level. And using the revenues could be used in a variety of ways. They could be refunded. They could be used to reduce other taxes. And I think they would provide a great opportunity as well for substitute, they could be an excellent substitute for a lot of the regulations that are in place. So there's agreement here.
And with regard to the revenue neutrality, I would offer my comment in the form of a question. Do you really expect $3 trillion to walk down K Street unmolested?
Okay. I don't know what to say to that. Hope the question wasn't for me. This social carbon tax is a perfect example of government making the simple complicated. I don't think we'll ever agree. It's a social number. It's a political number. That's what it seems to me, and I'm very new to this game. I guess what I'm more concerned about is, as I watch the Olympics in China and so on and so forth, it would seem to me that whatever measure you use, that some of our biggest competitors are producing more of this carbon. And I'm just curious, in the big scheme of things in today's world, how much carbon is America producing in relationship to China or India, regardless of the social cost? We can argue, but what percentage are we now responsible for?
I think let's call this a rough number. I think historically, right now China's producing about 50% more per year than we are. I think we are the second largest emitter, larger than the EU, larger than India. I think starting from the Industrial Revolution, someone else might know here, but I'm going to guess that I think we're responsible for about maybe a quarter of all emissions.
Okay.
Yes, but we are becoming more efficient. Our emissions intensity, which is the amount of CO2 produced per unit GDP, has dropped more rapidly than pretty much everywhere. And that didn't happen because of regulations. It happened because of markets. So if you want efficiency, you would prefer economic reasons.
I want to move on. So I grew up in a small town between two refineries, oil refineries. So proud that our air in Kansas is cleaner today than it was when I was growing up, and the waters are cleaner. Want to keep moving in that direction. Back to my point, manufacturing. I'm trying to figure out why manufacturing jobs have left Kansas, and one of them is the cost of energy. Does anybody have any solutions? How do we encourage China, India, other countries to take leads in this well and responsibilities? Does anybody have any solutions? Do we tax them, or I don't want to read. Does anyone have any solutions on how we encourage them to get in this game?
I think Dr. Geyer outlined one effective tool, which would be to have a carbon tax and then have some border tax adjustment, so that if people tried to import, so let's say steel that had carbon embedded in it, or carbon was used to produce it, they would face the same carbon tax that domestic producers would face.
But you would adjust that per country, or how would you figure out, Europe's doing good, Germany's doing good, but China's not?
Yeah, so you'd have to, there would be some complexity, I think, but it's eminently doable.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Higgins, Louisiana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We're here to discuss the real cost of carbon as it's imposed upon the American people. And it's interesting to note that in discussing the social cost of carbon, I've heard terms like the overwhelming consensus of scientific opinion and real science. And yet, the measurement standards use a 300-year window to determine actual taxation and costs placed upon the American people. And it's interesting to consider that we're very fortunate that we're not bound by the science of 300 years ago when we would be discussing geocentricity, alchemy, spontaneous generation of life, and the hollow earth. And yet, scientists tend to speak as if their scientific calculations are absolute and unchallengeable. To me, the real overwhelming consensus is that the social cost of carbon is a cost measured not by 300-year windows of manipulated science, but the contemporary and very real cost of American jobs and American treasure. So I asked Dr. Dayaratna, you mentioned there are updated equilibrium climate sensitivity distributions. These ECS distributions quantify the Earth's projected temperature response to a doubling of carbon dioxide concentrations. As you note, these recent ECS distributions appear to reflect a lower chance of extreme global warming in response to increased carbon dioxide concentrations. Can you explain, or can you give us some insight? Are you aware of why the previous administration, through the Interagency Working Group, failed to update the SCC or any other social costs of greenhouse gas estimates to reflect these more up-to-date ECS distributions? If it was not a political decision, then please explain, what was it?
So the Roe-Baker distribution that was published in 2007 is calibrated to a priori assumptions that the IWG wanted to make regarding global warming based on, a compiled research discussed by the IPCC. The thing is that, again, that distribution is calibrated. It is not an empirical distribution. The percentiles were fitted based to assumptions that the working group wanted to make. Subsequent ECS distributions are actually empirically estimated. So they are much more worth considering. Now, the question regarding why were these new distributions not included, I think, quite frankly, the reason is that they lower the estimate of the SEC substantially. Even if you don't use a 7% discount rate, even if you use the assumptions that the IWG wanted to make regarding 2.5%, 3%, and 5%, you can still get a negative SEC using more up-to-date distributions because the fat tail of the Roe-Baker distribution has essentially gone on a diet with the newer, more up-to-date ECS distributions, signifying the lower probability of global warming.
Dr. Michaels, you have something to add?
I think Kevin is right.
Your mic's not on.
Please press your mic. Thank you.
It was not a lower probability of global warming. It's a lower probability of high-end global warming. High-end global warming, yeah. And that is correct.
And with the increase of carbon emissions measured globally, would it not be a reasonable consideration that greenhouse gas effect would in fact assist the economies of the earth regarding agricultural production?
Well, the effect of carbon dioxide, the direct effect on plants is well documented, and the image that I showed at the end of my presentation, which is a very recent image, documents the actual greening of much of the earth, not just the agricultural component of the earth. And it's very reassuring to see that the largest greenings, and they are very, very large, tends to take place in the margins of the deserts, south of the Sahara, and in the northern parts of the tropical rainforest, where we were very concerned.
Dr. Greenstone, I believe Mr. Chairman has something to add, although I'm out of time.
Your time has expired. Sorry. Chair recognizes Mr. Babin.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Fascinating testimony. I want to thank everyone for being here as witnesses. I represent 36th District in Texas, which contains the highest concentration of chemical plants and oil refineries of any one district in the entire country. So when the federal government issues carbon regulations based on questionable data and methods, this is of great concern to me because they have a direct and significant impact on my constituents. And Dr. Dayaratna, putting things into perspective from the Industrial Revolution, what association do you see between carbon dioxide emissions and the health of our economy? And along with what some of you folks have already said, obviously it's going to be a drag, but I'd like to hear you elaborate a little bit more on that.
Okay, well, no, that's a very good question, Congressman. So here's the thing, and a lot of people take for granted that energy is a fundamental building block of civilization. So whether it's, you know, powering this room, lighting up our homes, powering our cars, and so forth, we all depend on energy. So when we think about, you know, this whole concept of SCC, the whole goal is to reduce carbon dioxide emissions, and what we end up doing is moving away from the least expensive and most efficient forms of electricity to more expensive and less efficient forms. So, and the bottom line is, economically, what we'll notice is that when we go to these so-called lower carbon emitting, you know, forms of energy, what we would notice is a dramatic change to the economy in the long run. You know, a carbon tax, as I was talking about in my testimony, would, in conjunction with the SCC, would result in around 400,000 lost jobs on average by 2035, 13 to 20% increase in electricity prices, and a $2.5 trillion loss in GDP. Now, on the other hand, and I've also researched this question, if we were to take advantage of the vast shale oil and gas we have in this country, we'd actually see the exact opposite. In fact, even more so in the other direction. We would see a $3.7 trillion increase in GDP. Personal income would skyrocket.
Absolutely.
And, yeah, all sorts of things that would benefit the economy.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much for that testimony. And Dr. Michaels, it's interesting to hear you put a historic and prehistoric context into all this.
I've lived that long.
Well, as a student of history, I've read some of the Norse settlements coming from Norway over to Iceland and on to Greenland, and they had settlements there, I think, from the year 1000, and had trade and regular routine ships calling on them from Europe for a couple to 300 years. And they were in the process of raising livestock, had hay crops. And then, strangely, it had been over 150 years when a ship called on them in the 1500s. None of that community was left. And by that time, the climate had cooled off considerably. The hay crops were no longer there. The folks had disappeared. So I don't think there was a huge amount of industrialism, carbon dioxide being released into the earth from humans during those centuries. So if you can kind of address that as well, along with some of the other gems.
Well, the nature of climate is to change.
Right.
It is because we are not a uniform Earth. We do not have a circular orbit. The sun varies, and the infrared absorption of the atmosphere varies, sometimes with human activities. It's, what did I say? It's complicated, Congressman. And the problem is, in the illustration that I showed, comparing the satellite and weather balloon observations to the average of the United Nations 107 computer models shows that it's so complicated that we haven't gotten close to getting it right. And why would you base a policy upon something that is so blatantly wrong?
Thank you so very much. And the American people deserve to know the truth here and have sound scientific data, and that's what this hearing is all about. I want to thank everybody again for being here, and I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Chair recognizes Mr. Weber for Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a question for each of y'all. There seemed to be some discussion about whether climate change was real and what that meant and the definition. So here's my question for each of you individually, and we'll start with you, Dr. Gayer. Would you agree that climate change is caused by temperature fluctuation?
Yes.
Dr.
Dayaratna.
Thank you.
Question is, would I agree that climate change is
It's caused by temperature fluctuation?
Yes.
How about you, Dr. Greenstone?
Yeah, it's a function of temperature variation. It's also a function of CO2 emissions.
Temperature variation is a good one, too. I didn't mention CO2. I'll come back to you. Dr. Michaels, would you agree climate change is caused by temperature fluctuation?
It is the contrast, It is the contrast in temperature between the surface and the upper atmosphere that drives most of the precipitation mechanisms on Earth. So the answer would be, if that changes, yes.
Okay, I'll take that as a yes. Dr. Gayer, would you agree that temperatures fluctuate when seasons change?
Yes.
Doctor?
Yes.
Dr. Greenstone?
Yes, I also think they fluctuate.
Dr. Michaels?
CO2.
Me for.
Okay. Dr. Gayer, back to you. Would you agree that temperatures fluctuate in historical, global, cyclical fashion? In other words, we have historical evidence that the temperatures have changed up or down historically.
Yeah, I don't know cyclical necessarily, but
Well,
yes,
okay,
it's gone up, it's gone down.
Gave you that. How about you,
Yes.
Doctor?
Yes.
Dr. Greenstone, would you agree with that?
Yeah, I also think that it varies.
It's just a
depending on
yes or
CO2
no.
emissions.
Dr. Michaels?
I will use the weasel word quasi-cyclical.
Gotcha. Okay. Now, would you agree also, doctors, that the temperatures actually fluctuate more when seasons change? Obviously, they go up drastically in Texas to 100, 110 in the desert area sometimes, or they go way down below. So when it changes from fall to winter, for example, temperatures fluctuate wildly. Would you agree with that, Dr. Gayer?
I'm confused by the question because I thought that was the
Would you agree
previous
that
question.
temperatures fluctuate more when seasons change than they just do from week to week, for example?
Yes.
Okay, Dr. Dayaratna?
Yes.
Okay, Dr. Greenstone, minus the CO2 component, CO2.
I think CO2 is an important determinant of temperature. I also think season's an important determinant.
Dr. Michaels, would you agree they fluctuate more wildly when seasons change?
Yes, sir.
Great. So we know that the temperature fluctuate when seasons change. Now we're talking about a carbon tax. And so if you go back to where we're going to charge carbon tax for people on industry or countries, let's say, that have industry, are we going to take into account when their seasons change because now they're using more electricity when it's hot or more electricity when it's cold? Do you take that into account at all in the proposed carbon tax? Do they get a credit because it was when it's mild, they have a mild season?
The goal of the carbon tax is to include a price into the energy decision. So certainly when they use more energy, the tax will go higher, and to the extent you're tying it to a tax reduction somewhere else, the revenue will go higher.
They do get a credit when it's mild. I got you. Yeah. Okay. Now, what happens when those countries have a tremendous catastrophe, whether it's a huge hurricane or a huge cyclone, tsunami, or you name it? Do they get, and they're really hard hit and they have to have more energy production to rebuild their country, do they then get a tax credit to be able to go back and rebuild their country? Or do we punish them more because now they're using more energy to rebuild?
Can I ask a clarifying?
No, I'm asking him first, Dr. Gaines.
I don't understand the tax.
So to countries,
so you level the tax increases the price of energy. Yes.
So no matter what happens in a country, if they have a huge catastrophe, and they have to use a lot of energy to rebuild their country, they don't get a break. They're just going to pay more carbon tax at that point.
Yeah, that's the nature of a tax.
Doctor, you agree with that?
That I've never put together a carbon tax proposal myself, but in principle, though, yeah, that seems
that's
to be
what's going to
people
happen.
wanna
Dr.
do,
Greenstone, you agree that's going to happen? They use more energy, more carbon to rebuild their country, and they're going to get taxed.
I just want to clarify if we're talking about a hurricane disaster that's due to CO2 accumulation in the atmosphere, or just one that
Talking about the tax once they have a disaster. Do you know where I'm going, Dr. Michaels? Can you see what I'm asking here?
Yes, I believe that you are drawing the analogy to what happened to this House when it passed cap and trade in 2009.
Well, that was a catastrophe, all right.
Correct.
But so here's the point I'm making. Now, suppose an industry comes along and they develop a function, a process of capturing CO2 and putting it underground. Do we revoke the carbon tax?
No, you credit it.
Credit it.
That's one of the nice incentives of having a tax, because it incentivizes those kind of technological improvements.
Okay.
In fact, it would be terrific. It would provide a market incentive to engage, for people to find ways to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere.
Okay, well, let me just add for the record, Mr. Chairman, and I'm done, that in my district, we have the largest carbon capture storage unit, air products, over in the Jefferson County in the country. So it's just interesting food for thought where we're headed with this idea. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thanks. I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional comments and written questions from members. This hearing is adjourned.